In the early hours of a grey Moscow morning, Dr. Elena Petrovna stepped into the sterile, fluorescent-lit trauma center of the Central Military Hospital. Just 2 days on the job, her credentials barely processed, Elena was already branded as the replacement surgeon. The senior medical staff had begrudgingly accepted her only because the senior surgeon had left for a conference in St. Petersburg. But when the sirens wailed through the building, alerting them to a multi-vehicle collision just outside the city, Elena did not hesitate. She stood up from her desk and walked toward the trauma bay, her steps steady, a sense of urgency in the air. The ambulance doors burst open, revealing a scene so horrific that it should have been impossible. The first patient, a young man in his 20s, had a steering column embedded in his chest. "Call Dr. Morozov," someone shouted, but Elena had already moved. There was no time. She was already gloved and examining the patient's vitals, making a decision in the seconds before the chaos unfolded. "If we don't act now, he will die in 3 minutes, Elena said with the calmness of a seasoned surgeon, not a novice. Dr. Morozov rushed in seconds later, ready to take charge. But Elena was already inside the man's chest, stitching the internal organs together with a precision that froze him in his tracks. As the monitors beeped steadily, the impossible was happening. The young man's heart was beating again, against all odds. "Who trained you?" Morozov whispered under his breath. But before he could question further, the second victim arrived. Another casualty from the crash. A woman in her 30s, unconscious and barely breathing. "I need 2 liters of blood immediately and prepare a massive transfusion protocol," Elena barked, her voice resolute. She did not explain herself, nor did she hesitate. As the team scrambled to keep up, Elena worked with such focus that it felt as if she had done this countless times before. It was clear she had learned not in the controlled environment of a hospital, but in places where the pressure of survival was constant and the rules of modern medicine were bent or broken. She made decisions that should have been impossible, saving lives when time and resources were scarce. She operated with an efficiency that made it seem like a war zone, not a hospital. As the second patient stabilized, Elena moved on to the third, a teenage girl, barely 16, her body riddled with injuries. A ruptured spleen, a collapsed lung, brain trauma, all of which would require prioritization. The other doctors stood frozen, unsure of which injury to treat first. But Elena was already calculating. She didn't follow standard procedure. She didn't have the luxury of time. "We save her all," Elena said, directing her team in a way that left no room for argument. Within minutes, the girl was stable. The fourth patient was a man who had been clinically dead for 6 minutes. Most doctors would have called it, but not Elena. She did something with her hands, a technique she had learned in war zones, and within seconds the heart monitor beeped back to life. The air in the room grew thick with tension as Morozov watched her with suspicion, his phone pressed to his ear. He was already making calls to confirm something he had suspected. "There's no record of you at any of the hospitals you claim to have worked at," Morozov said, his voice cutting through the air. "There's no record of you, Elena Petrovna." But Elena remained unflinching. She continued her work, a quiet resolve behind her eyes. The fifth patient came in next, her body burned beyond recognition, smoke inhalation choking her lungs. Elena knew there was no time to waste, so she worked quickly, prioritizing her actions with a military precision that surprised even the most seasoned doctors. She had learned her skills in places where hospitals didn't exist, where she had fought to keep soldiers alive, where the alternatives were too horrific to contemplate. As she stabilized the patient and prepared her for transfer to intensive care, Morozov pulled Elena aside, his voice lowering. "Watch her carefully," he said. "I don't believe her credentials. I think we're dealing with someone who's been through more than a residency." Her hands did not shake, and her mind did not waver. She kept moving. Then the sixth patient arrived, a pregnant woman who had suffered blunt force trauma to the abdomen. The medical team was divided on what to do, save the mother or save the child. But Elena didn't hesitate. "Both," she ordered, and within the hour, both mother and child were stable. Elena's eyes darted toward the monitor with practiced calm, her mind already running through the next challenge. But that's when the seventh victim arrived, the drunk driver who had caused the crash. His injuries were the worst of them all. But he had to be saved. Morozov stood in front of Elena, blocking her path. "Enough," he said. "You've done more than enough today. Let someone else handle him." But Elena wouldn't stop. The choices she made were not about following orders. They were about saving lives when others would give up. As she prepared for the 7th surgery, the voice of the administrator rang through her mind. "Dr. Petrovna, you need rest." Elena ignored him. "How many are still critical?" she asked, looking at the board. 5. Morozov didn't respond. He knew better than to argue. Elena was already walking toward the trauma bay again, determined to make another impossible save. The hours passed like minutes in the trauma center. Elena had not stopped for a moment since the chaos began. The clock on the wall ticked relentlessly, but she felt no fatigue, no fear. Her hands moved with the precision of someone who had performed these procedures in the most challenging conditions imaginable. A doctor who had once operated in war zones, in places where a sterile room was a luxury, and every moment of hesitation could cost lives. Her heart did not race. It did not hesitate. It calculated, assessed, and moved forward. The room was silent as the 7th patient was wheeled in, a man who had caused the disaster. The team gathered around, but Elena barely acknowledged them. She was already at his side, gloved and ready to work. The man's pulse was faint, and his face was a mixture of confusion and alcohol-induced stupor. He had been the catalyst for the destruction, but in Elena's hands, everyone deserved a chance. Her fingers worked swiftly, cutting away the damage and finding a path through the carnage. The others stood still, watching her like she was a stranger. Even Morozov had stepped back. The man stabilized. Against all odds, he was alive. But it wasn't enough to be alive. Elena moved on to the next patient, a veteran, an officer who had been injured in the crash, his wounds severe, his injuries a long road to recovery. His blood had already spilled across the trauma bay floor, yet Elena was not disturbed. The chaos around her seemed to dissipate, leaving only her and the patient. And as the lights above her flickered, with the urgency of each life slipping through her fingers, Elena knew she was not just saving them. She was making a statement. She was proving to herself that she could survive, that she could still make a difference in a world where the lines of right and wrong were often blurred. As the team moved to wheel the 6th patient to the recovery area, Elena turned her focus to the 7th victim, the driver who had caused the crash. Morozov blocked her path once again, his voice low. "Enough," he said. "This man, you don't owe him anything." But Elena's mind had already made its decision. She needed to save him, to prove to herself that no matter the cost, every life deserved a chance. As she prepared for the surgery, a sudden commotion in the hallway drew her attention. The administrator, a man who had already shown signs of hesitation, was on the phone, his face pale. The lights flickered once more, this time casting long shadows across the room. Elena's hands were still moving, but her mind was beginning to piece together something. Something was off. She had seen the news reports, the mysterious deaths, the sudden disappearances of military personnel, and the accidents that didn't add up. There were too many questions, too many coincidences. But here in this hospital, her job was simple: save lives. But in the back of her mind, she knew it was never that simple. The doctor had become more than just a healer. She was a soldier, and her mission had only begun. "You've done your part," Morozov said again, his voice laced with urgency. But Elena had no intention of stopping. She had made it this far, and she would not let anyone dictate her actions now. She was not some puppet in a game of government intrigue. She was Elena Petrovna, and if she could save them all, she would, no matter the cost. The final patient arrived, the most challenging of them all. A man in his 40s, badly injured but somehow still clinging to life. Elena didn't need to ask what had happened. She knew the drill. He was one of them. He was one of the people who had orchestrated this disaster. Someone with connections, someone who could be a potential target. But in Elena's eyes, he was just another life that needed saving. Her hands moved without thought. She didn't have to stop and think. She didn't need to calculate. She had done this before, in places where even the slightest hesitation could lead to death. She had learned long ago that saving someone meant more than just physical survival. It was about giving them a second chance, a choice. But in this room, in this hospital, there were no choices left. The 7th patient was now stabilized, and Elena could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on her. She had done everything she could. She had saved 7 lives, 7 impossible saves. But now, standing in the aftermath, Eleanor realized she wasn't just dealing with injuries. She was dealing with something much bigger. Something that had been pulling the strings from behind the scenes. The sound of footsteps outside the door brought Elena back to the present. The time had come. She had done her job, but there were other forces at play now. Forces that could undo everything she had worked for. As the doors opened, Eleanor knew the world outside the hospital had already started to change. And so had she. The tension in the trauma center thickened as Elena stepped away from the patient's bedside. The adrenaline of saving 7 lives had begun to fade, replaced with the bitter realization that there were forces beyond her control at play. Outside, the world seemed oblivious to the high-stakes drama unfolding in the sterile hallways of the hospital. As she moved down the corridor, the sterile smell of antiseptic filled her nose, but it did little to calm her nerves. Her mind raced as she passed staff members who gave her lingering looks of admiration and confusion. Elena knew it was only a matter of time before the other shoe dropped. The hospital administrator, a tall man in his 50s with graying hair, approached her with a clipboard in hand. "Dr. Petrovna, a moment of your time," he said, his voice strangely formal. Elena looked at him without expression. He had been watching her all day, observing her every move with increasing suspicion. She had felt the gaze of the entire trauma team, and she had seen the flicker of doubt in their eyes. She was no longer just a new surgeon in a chaotic environment. She was a woman with a past that they were too afraid to question, a woman who had done things that no one should know about. "You've saved lives today," he said, his eyes narrowing as he glanced over her shoulder at the still bustling trauma bay. "But we need to talk about your credentials. The investigation is ongoing." Eleanor stiffened, her back straightening. She knew what he was referring to. The questions that had begun to surface about her past, her record, the places she had worked before coming here. "My credentials are valid," Eleanor replied, her voice cold and controlled. She had learned long ago that when the heat was on, the only thing that mattered was keeping her calm, keeping her focus. The administrator didn't seem convinced. His eyes flicked nervously to the end of the hallway, where 2 men in dark suits stood watching, their presence too deliberate to be overlooked. Elena could feel the weight of their eyes on her. They were here for her, she knew that now. They were here to find out who she really was. "I don't know what you think you're doing," she said flatly. "But I've done my job today. 7 people are alive because of me. You can take your investigation and shove it." The administrator stepped back, clearly startled by her words, but he was too late to stop her. Eleanor had already turned on her heel and was walking toward the exit. She didn't look back. She couldn't. But as she moved toward the elevator, a cold chill settled in the pit of her stomach. The FBI agents had been waiting for her outside, and the administrator's warning had only confirmed her worst fears. She was a ghost in the eyes of the world, but the people she had been running from for years had finally caught up to her. Eleanor's mind raced as she stepped into the elevator. Her entire life had been a series of careful escapes, identities changed, lives left behind. But every time she thought she had disappeared, they found her. And now the stakes had changed. She was no longer just a doctor. She was a soldier again. A soldier with a past she couldn't outrun. The doors opened to the parking lot. And Elena saw them standing there, 2 men in suits, both armed with the calm professionalism of people who had dealt with people like her before. One of them stepped forward. "Dr. Petrovna, we need to talk," he said, his voice even but carrying the weight of authority. Elena didn't flinch. "I'm not going anywhere with you," she said, her words sharp and final. The man raised an eyebrow, as if expecting her to say something different. "You will," he replied. "It's only a matter of time before you do. You can cooperate, or we can do this the hard way. But either way, we need to ask you some questions." Elena's eyes narrowed. "About what?" she demanded. "About your past," the second man said. "About who you really are. The records we have on you are incomplete. You've been hiding from us for a long time. We want to know why." Eleanor could feel the weight of their words settle in her chest. The past had finally caught up with her, and this time there would be no escape. She had worked in the shadows for so long, saving lives, saving people who had no one else. But now everything was coming to a head. The past was no longer a distant memory. It was standing right in front of her, and it had come to collect. "I don't know what you think you know," Eleanor said, her voice trembling with an emotion she couldn't quite suppress. "But I'm not who you think I am, and I'm not going anywhere with you." The men looked at each other for a long moment. Then the first man stepped forward, his hand resting on the handle of a briefcase. "You don't have a choice," he said coldly. "You're going to help us, whether you like it or not." Elena's hands clenched into fists. She had been running from this moment for too long. She had been hiding in plain sight, pretending to be someone she wasn't. But now there was no more hiding. There was only the choice she would have to make. And in the face of it, Eleanor knew what she had to do. "I'll help you," she said quietly, "but on my terms. And no one, not even you, will control me again." Eleanor's words hung in the air as she stood face to face with the men who had come to claim her, who had come to drag her back into the life she had fought so hard to escape. The tension was palpable, thick with the weight of years of secrets and lies. She could feel the cold eyes of the two agents on her, calculating, watching for any sign of weakness, but she had no intention of showing them any. Her hands remained steady at her sides, her mind already moving, already calculating the next steps. The man with the briefcase, the one who had spoken first, studied her for a long moment before responding. "You're going to make this harder than it needs to be, aren't you?" he asked, his voice laced with frustration. Elena didn't answer. She didn't need to. She knew what was coming. The second agent, taller, with sharp features and an air of superiority, stepped forward. "We know who you are, Dr. Petrovna," he said, his voice quieter but no less menacing. "You can pretend to be someone else, but we know the truth. We know about the years you spent in the military, about the operations you were involved in, about the people you saved, and the people you killed." Elena stiffened, but only slightly. She had learned long ago to hide the emotions that threatened to surface at moments like these. The memories of the things she had done, the lives she had taken, were never far from her mind. But she had buried them. She had made peace with her past, or at least she had tried. She wasn't the same person she had been. Not anymore. "You don't know anything about me," Eleanor replied, her voice steady. The taller agent sneered. "We know enough to know that you're exactly what we need." The first agent opened his briefcase and pulled out a folder. He placed it in front of Elena, and she recognized the symbol on the top, the seal of the Federal Security Service. A chill ran down her spine. This was no ordinary investigation. This was something far deeper, far more dangerous. "We need your help, Dr. Petrovna," the agent said, his voice softening. "You're the only one who can do what we need. And in exchange, we'll make sure your past stays buried. You'll be free. You'll never have to look over your shoulder again." Elena's gaze flicked over the folder, but she didn't open it. She already knew what was inside. Documents, orders, assignments she had long since left behind. She had moved on. But they hadn't. They were dragging her back into the fold, back into a world she had tried so desperately to escape. "What do you want from me?" Eleanor asked, her voice low and resigned. "We want you to work for us," the agent said, his voice carrying the weight of authority. "We have a mission for you, one that only you can complete. You'll be working with the highest levels of the government, handling operations that are far beyond the scope of anything you've done before." Eleanor felt the weight of his words settle on her chest. She had been in operations like this before, missions where the line between right and wrong was blurred beyond recognition, where the consequences of failure were too high to even contemplate. But that was a lifetime ago. She wasn't that person anymore. She had built a new life, a life where she could save people without worrying about the consequences. Or so she had hoped. The agents exchanged a look, as if waiting for her to make a decision. Elena took a deep breath, her mind racing. She had no choice, not really. They had found her, and there was nowhere left to run. They knew too much. They had too many strings to pull. "I'll help you," Elena said, her voice steady. "But I won't be your pawn. I'm not going to do whatever you ask without understanding the consequences. And I'm not going to be used as a tool for your dirty work." The agents nodded, their expressions unreadable. "We wouldn't expect anything less," the first agent said. "But understand this, Dr. Petrovna. You don't have the luxury of choice anymore. This is the only way forward." Elena felt a wave of anger surge within her, but she tamped it down. She had no illusions. This was the price she would have to pay for her past mistakes. She had no choice but to accept it. "I'll do it," Elena said, her voice cold and resigned. "But you better make sure I'm in control of my own decisions. I won't be your weapon." The agents smiled, but there was no warmth in their expressions. "We'll see," the second agent said. "We'll see." Elena stood silently as the agents gathered their things and left. She had made her choice. There was no turning back now. But as she watched them disappear down the hallway, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had just sealed her own fate. The past was never far behind. It was always waiting, lurking in the shadows, ready to pull her back into the darkness. And this time, there was no escape. Elena returned to her small apartment on the outskirts of Moscow, her mind racing. The sounds of the city outside were muffled by the walls, but the silence inside her apartment was deafening. She had done what she needed to do, agreed to help the FSB as much as it twisted her stomach. But the reality of what that meant was beginning to sink in. She couldn't deny the truth. She had never truly left her past behind. The FSB had found her once more, and there was nowhere to run this time. They knew everything. They had engineered a situation that would force her to show her true skills. Skills she had learned in the most brutal, unforgiving environments. The same skills that had made her an asset to the military, an asset that had disappeared after she exposed the atrocities committed by those in power. Elena sat down at her small kitchen table and opened the folder the agents had left with her. Inside there were more documents, missions, objectives, and a list of targets. Her heart sank as she scanned the details. The FSB wanted her for one thing, to clean up their messes, to eliminate threats that had grown too large for their own dirty hands to handle. She was the perfect tool for the job. But at what cost? She had lived in the shadows for so long, hidden from the world, from her past. The last thing she wanted was to return to the life she had once known, to become the monster they wanted her to be. But the FSB had a way of making sure their agents had no choice. She had seen it before, people who had been forced into their service, whose identities had been erased, whose lives had been reduced to nothing more than a series of tasks to be completed. She was now one of them. There was no going back. As she stared at the documents in front of her, Elena knew that the choice she had made would shape the rest of her life. She had to do it, not for the government or for the FSB, but for herself. She had spent too long running, hiding from the past. Now she had to face it head-on, even if it meant doing things she could never justify. She sighed deeply and ran a hand through her hair. The phone on the table rang, pulling her from her thoughts. She picked it up, her eyes still locked on the folder in front of her. "Dr. Petrovna," the voice on the other end was calm, measured. "We need you to come in. We have another mission for you. One that requires your unique skill set." Elena closed her eyes, feeling the weight of the words. She knew what was coming. She had no choice but to comply. "I'll be there," she said, her voice flat, resigned. The voice on the other end hesitated before speaking again. "Remember, Elena, this is the only option. You help us and we protect you. You refuse and you'll have nowhere left to run." She hung up without responding. She had already made up her mind. She would go. It was the only way to ensure her survival, the only way to keep her past from swallowing her whole. She had no illusions about what she was doing. She wasn't saving lives anymore. She was taking them, one by one. Elena stood up, taking one last look around her apartment. This place had never felt like home. It had only been a temporary hiding place, a small corner of the world where she could pretend to be someone else. But she had known all along that it wasn't real. And now, she was about to leave it behind for good. She grabbed the folder, tucked it under her arm, and walked out of the apartment. The world outside had changed since she first arrived in Moscow, but it was still the same, full of danger, full of secrets. And now, Elena Petrovna was a part of it, whether she wanted to be or not. As she stepped into the street, she didn't look back. She couldn't. Her future was already written, and it was too late to change it. She had crossed a line, and there was no going back. The mission awaited her, and with it, the weight of everything she had done, and everything she would have to do. Elena's path was set. The only question now was whether she could survive it. Elena arrived at the FSB facility. a nondescript building tucked away in a quiet corner of Moscow. The air outside was cold, with a crispness that cut through her coat. But the coldness inside was something far worse. The walls, the lighting, and even the sterile, emotionless faces of the agents who greeted her were all reminders of the world she had willingly re-entered. The FSB was like a spider's web. Once you were caught, there was no escape. She had seen it before, the way they controlled their agents, using fear, loyalty, and coercion to get what they wanted. And now she was part of that system again. She walked through the labyrinth of grey hallways with purposeful steps, her heart heavy with the weight of her decision. The door to the briefing room opened, and inside several high-ranking officials were gathered around a table, their faces grim and unreadable. Elena had been here before, in the same room with the same people many years ago. But this time, it was different. She wasn't a soldier. She wasn't an officer. She was a surgeon, a tool to be used for their dirty work. A man in his 50s stood at the head of the table, his expression as cold as the walls around them. "Dr. Petrovna," he said, his voice carrying an edge of authority that commanded the room, "we've assigned you to a mission, one that requires your expertise. You've been through enough to understand the gravity of this." Elena didn't respond immediately. She knew what was coming. She had been through too many operations to count, too many missions that had blurred the line between right and wrong. But she was no longer the same person she had been. "We need you to perform a series of surgeries on high-value targets," the man continued, his eyes flicking to the folder in front of him. "These individuals have information we need. They cannot be allowed to live. They must be eliminated." Elena felt the cold grip of anger rise in her chest, but she controlled it. She had to. This was the life she had chosen, whether she liked it or not. "I understand," she said, her voice steady. "When do I start?" The man smiled, a cruel twist of his lips. "Immediately. We've already arranged for your transportation. You'll be flown to a secure facility in the Caucasus, where you'll carry out the procedures." Elena's stomach tightened. She had been to the Caucasus before, during her time as a military surgeon. The region was dangerous, full of conflict and instability, and the people she would be operating on were not innocent bystanders. They were enemies of the state, people whose deaths would ensure the safety of the Russian Federation. "And what happens after I complete the surgeries?" Elena asked, her voice betraying nothing of her inner turmoil. The man's eyes locked onto hers. "After you complete the surgeries, you'll return to Moscow, and you'll be well compensated for your work. You'll also be given full protection. We'll make sure you're safe." Elena knew better than to believe him. Protection, safety, it was all part of the game they played. Once she completed the mission, she would be disposable, just like all the others who had been used by the system. But she had no choice. She had already crossed that line. She was part of the machine now, and there was no turning back. She nodded, her mind racing with the implications of what she had just agreed to. "I'll do it," she said, her voice cold and final. The man nodded, satisfied. "Good, you leave in an hour." Elena left the briefing room, the weight of the mission settling on her shoulders. She had saved 7 lives, but now she was about to take more. There was no longer any space for doubt, no time for hesitation. The past had caught up to her, and there was no escaping it. She had made her choice. Now she had to live with it. The FSB had its claws in her, and there was no telling where it would end. She had been a soldier, a surgeon, and now she was a weapon once more. Elena left the facility without a word. She had already made her decision. The mission would begin soon, and she would be ready. But even as she walked out into the cold Moscow night, a part of her couldn't help but wonder what she had become. What had she lost in the process? And could she ever find her way back to the person she had once been? The flight to the Caucasus was long and silent. Elena sat alone in the back of the FSB jet, her eyes staring out of the small window, the jagged mountain peaks rising against the horizon like sentinels. The flight had been arranged swiftly, and the military personnel who accompanied her said little. They were only there to ensure the success of the mission, to make sure she did what was required. Elena had no illusions about what was happening. The mission was already set in motion, and she was nothing more than a tool. But as the mountains grew closer, she felt something stir within her, something that had been buried for a long time, the past. She had been here before. Not in this exact place, but in the chaos of conflict, in the dark corners of the world where morality was a luxury and survival was all that mattered. Eleanor closed her eyes, trying to shut out the memories, the screams, the blood, the faces of the people she had saved and the ones she had lost. It had all become a blur over time, a haze that she had learned to live with. But it was still there, lurking beneath the surface. She had been trained to make impossible decisions, to operate when the world was burning around her. She had saved countless lives, but she had also taken them. And now she was about to do it again. She had no choice. The mission required her expertise, and the FSB had made it clear that failure was not an option. The plane descended toward the small, secluded airstrip. Elena didn't flinch as the wheels touched the ground. She had been in more dangerous places than this. The difference now was that she wasn't just a surgeon anymore. She was a pawn in a game much bigger than herself. The vehicle waiting for her was a military jeep, its engine running as two soldiers stood at attention. Eleanor climbed into the back without a word. The soldiers didn't speak to her, but she could feel their eyes on her, calculating, watching her every move. As they drove through the rugged terrain, Elena thought about what lay ahead. The target, an influential figure in the intelligence community, was already in custody. He had vital information that the FSB needed to secure their control. And Eleanor was the one who would ensure that he didn't survive long enough to reveal anything. It was a simple mission, one that required precision. Elena's hands were steady as she thought about the surgery she would need to perform. The target's injuries were severe and the operation was dangerous. But she had done worse. She had done impossible things before. When they arrived at the facility, Elena was ushered into a small, sterile room. The target was already unconscious, strapped to a table. The agents overseeing the operation gave her only the briefest of instructions before leaving her alone with the man. Elena stood over him, looking down at the patient who would not survive the night. He was a man with information, dangerous information, and he would never be allowed to speak. Her hands moved automatically, as if she had done this 1,000 times before. The cuts were precise, calculated. She wasn't here to heal. She was here to extract information and to make sure the man would never reveal what he knew. As the minutes stretched on, Elena's mind drifted back to the decision she had made to get to this point. She had chosen this path. No one had forced her. The FSB had given her a choice, but it wasn't really a choice at all. There was no escaping the past. She had known that. As she worked, the sound of the knife against flesh was the only sound in the room. The man's body tensed, but he remained unconscious, unaware of what was happening to him. Elena's eyes narrowed as she completed the final incision. The mission was over. She had done what was required, but as she stepped back from the table, the weight of what she had done hit her. She had saved lives in the past, but this was different. This wasn't about healing. This was about control. The FSB had used her skills, manipulated her into becoming something she had spent years trying to escape. She was no longer the doctor who saved lives. She was the operative who took them. As she left the room, Eleanor could feel the eyes of the agents watching her again, assessing her, waiting for her next move. She had completed the mission, but the price of that success was steep. She had crossed a line, and there was no turning back. The rest of the night passed in a blur. Elena was given a small room in a makeshift safe house. She sat on the edge of the bed, her mind racing with thoughts of what she had just done. But there was no time for reflection. There was no time for guilt or regret. The mission had been completed, and now Elena was left with the knowledge that there was no escaping the world she had entered. She was part of it now, a tool for those who held the power, and that was a reality she would have to live with. She stood up from the bed and walked to the window, staring out at the darkened landscape below. The future was uncertain. But one thing was clear: she was no longer the woman she once was. She had been remade, shaped by the world around her, and there was no going back. As the hours passed, Elena knew she would have to face the consequences of her choices. She had made them, and now she would live with them. There was no room for weakness in this life, no room for hesitation. And as the night wore on, Elena steeled herself for the path ahead. The FSB would use her again. They would call on her for more missions, more tasks to complete, and she would obey, because that was all she could do now. She was a part of their machine, and there was no escaping it. The morning came too soon, casting a dim light across the cold walls of the safe house. Eleanor woke with a start, the remnants of last night's operation still fresh in her mind. She had completed the mission as instructed, but the actions she had taken, actions she had once sworn never to repeat, haunted her. The sound of boots on the gravel outside the safe house pulled her from her thoughts. The FSB agents had arrived. They were efficient, as always, and already in the process of preparing Elena for her next assignment. She had expected it. There was no time to rest, no time to process what had happened. The FSB had a need, and Elena was the only one who could fulfill it. She was a weapon now, a tool to be used, and they didn't care about the cost. Elena didn't care to ask questions anymore. She didn't need to know who their next target was or why they needed her so badly. All that mattered was that she was part of the machine, whether she liked it or not. As she stepped into the back of the vehicle that would take her to the airport, the weight of her decision settled upon her once more. The mission would take her to a new location, to a place where she would perform more surgeries, more cleanups. The familiar pull of moral conflict tugged at her, but she had learned long ago to push it aside. The past didn't matter anymore. The people she saved, the people she killed, they were all part of the same cycle. Eleanor had entered this life for a reason. She was the best, and she would continue to prove it. The airport was a chaotic, bustling place, but to Elena it was just another step on the road she had chosen. The private jet waited on the tarmac, and she was ushered aboard by agents who said little but watched her closely. They knew what she had done, and they knew what she was capable of. But they didn't question her. They couldn't. Not after she had saved lives and taken them in equal measure. The flight was long, but Elena didn't speak. She didn't need to. The agents around her were simply tools in this game, tools that would eventually be discarded, just like her. The flight took them to a remote area of Russia, where the air was cold and the landscape was vast. Elena had been here before, many years ago, during her time with military intelligence. The memory of it made her feel even more like a ghost. Here, in this desolate place, she had been trained, molded into the soldier she had become. And now she had returned to carry out missions she would never forget. The operation they had brought her here for was no different from the others. The target was a high-ranking official, someone whose actions had put the state at risk. The FSB needed her to eliminate the threat, swiftly, quietly, with no trace left behind. Eleanor stood before the target, a man she had never met, but whose life was now in her hands. She didn't flinch. She didn't hesitate. Her hands were steady as she prepared for the operation, her mind focused entirely on the task at hand. The FSB agents watched from behind a glass partition, waiting for the signal that the job was done. Elena knew they were watching, but it didn't matter. She was no longer concerned with what they thought of her. She had crossed too many lines to care. The target was taken care of with precision, his life extinguished in a way that would leave no trace. Elena stood over him, her hands shaking slightly as she wiped the blood from her gloves. Another life taken, another mission completed. The weight of what she had just done settled upon her like a heavy stone. But there was no room for doubt. She had done what needed to be done. The FSB would use her again, just as they always did. And she would obey, because that was all she knew how to do now. As she walked away from the operation, Elena couldn't shake the feeling that she was losing herself. The more she performed these missions, the further she drifted from the person she once was. The person who had saved lives, the person who had cared about healing, about making a difference. That person was gone. And in her place stood a soldier, a weapon who followed orders without question. Elena had chosen this path. She had embraced it. But now she wasn't so sure it was the right choice. The FSB's power over her was absolute. They controlled her every move, and they would continue to use her until she was no longer useful. And when that day came, when she had outlived her purpose, they would dispose of her like a broken tool. There was no escaping it. Eleanor knew this was the life she had chosen, but it didn't make it any easier to bear. The truth was clear now. She had crossed too many lines to ever go back. The only thing left to do was survive. And to do that, Elena knew she would have to keep her emotions in check, to bury them deep down where they couldn't interfere with the work she was tasked to do. The FSB would continue to pull her strings, and she would continue to obey. There was no other option. As she boarded the helicopter that would take her to the next location, Elena closed her eyes, her mind already preparing for what was to come. The mission was everything, and she would do whatever it took to complete it. The next mission came quickly, like all the others. Elena had been transported to a military base in the mountains, where the air was thin and the surroundings were barren. It was the perfect location for an operation that required discretion, ammonin, and secrecy. The target was a man who had once been part of the Russian intelligence community but had turned rogue. Now he had information that could endanger national security, and the FSB needed him silenced. Elena wasn't concerned with the man's past or the reasons behind his betrayal. She didn't care who he was or what he had done. All that mattered was that he had to be eliminated, swiftly, without a trace. As she stood in the cold, silent hallway of the base, Elena could feel the weight of the mission pressing on her shoulders. She had been sent here to do one thing, and she would do it with the precision that had come to define her work. But even as she prepared, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. This mission, like all the others, was just another part of the game the FSB played. But this time, the lines between right and wrong seemed even more blurred. The target had once been a comrade, a fellow soldier in the war of intelligence and deception. But now he was a threat to the system they had all sworn to protect. Elena knew what she had to do. She had been trained for this, for missions that required her to operate in the darkest corners of society, where morality was a luxury and survival was the only goal. She had been trained to make impossible decisions, to choose who lived and who died, based on orders that came from those who held power. But as she made her way to the target's location, Elena couldn't help but wonder if she had lost something along the way. She had given up her identity, her past, and her soul for a system that treated people like pawns, disposable and replaceable. She had saved lives, but at what cost? The target was inside a secure building, surrounded by guards and armed security systems. But Elena was ready. She had been briefed on the location, the escape routes, and the security protocols. She knew exactly what to do. She moved through the building with military precision, her training taking over as she incapacitated the guards one by one. The darkness of the mission was nothing new to her. She had done this countless times before, in places where the stakes were higher, where the lives of civilians were at risk. But this time, there was something different. As Elena entered the room where the target was being held, she could feel the weight of the decision pressing on her. The man was sitting in a chair, his hands bound, his face bruised and blooded. He had been through hell, but so had she. They were not so different, after all. "Elena Petrovna," he said weakly, his voice raspy, "I never thought you'd come for me." Elena said nothing. She didn't need to. She stepped forward, her gloved hands already reaching for the tools she needed. But as she stood over him, ready to end his life, she hesitated. For the briefest moment, she thought about the years they had both served, about the missions they had completed together. But those years were gone. They didn't matter anymore. The target had become a liability, and Elena knew she had to follow through. She had made her choice. She had become the tool of a system that used people like her to do its dirty work. And she would continue to obey, because that was the only way she could survive. The target's eyes widened as he realized what was about to happen. "You don't have to do this," he said, his voice filled with desperation. "You don't have to be like them." Elena paused for a moment, looking into his eyes. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. She had already made up her mind. In a single, precise motion, Elena ended the man's life. There was no struggle, no hesitation. Just the cold, clinical execution of a mission that had been planned for months. Elena stood over him, her hands still steady, her heart still. She had done what she was trained to do, but as she left the room, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was losing herself piece by piece. The weight of the mission had taken its toll, and there was no turning back. She was no longer the person she had been. She was a tool, a weapon, and she would continue to be used until she had nothing left. As Elena made her way out of the building and into the waiting vehicle, the FSB agents surrounded her, nodding in approval. They had gotten what they needed. The operation was a success, but Elena knew the truth. The success of the mission didn't mean anything. Not really, because in the end, she was just another cog in the machine. A machine that would keep grinding until there was nothing left of her. and Elena wondered how long it would take before the machine spit her out, just like it had done with so many others. But for now, she was still useful, and as long as she would keep doing what she was told. Because in the world she now inhabited, survival was the only thing that mattered. The days blurred into one long series of missions, each more dangerous than the last. Elena was no longer just a surgeon. She had become a part of the machinery that kept the system running. The FSB used her, manipulated her, and in return they promised her protection. But Elena knew better. She knew that once her usefulness ran out, they would discard her like they had discarded so many others before her. She had crossed too many lines. She had done too many things she would never be able to forget. But there was no time for reflection, no time for remorse. The missions continued, each one taking her further down a path she couldn't escape. She was a soldier now, and soldiers followed orders. Elena had accepted this. The weight of her choices had settled on her shoulders like a heavy burden. There was no turning back. As she stepped into the helicopter that would take her to her next mission, Elena could feel the weight of the decision she had made. The past was gone, and there was no escaping it. She had chosen this life, and now she would live with it. The helicopter took off, flying high above the Russian countryside. Elena stared out the window, her mind racing. She was going to be dropped into another conflict zone, another place where the rules of engagement didn't exist. She had done this before, too many times. She had saved lives, but she had also taken them. She had been a soldier, a surgeon, and now she was a weapon. The FSB had made sure of that. They had molded her into something that no longer resembled the person she had once been. Elena looked down at the folder she held in her hands. The mission was simple. Eliminate the target, ensure that the information he possessed never sees the light of day. It was just another mission. But as the helicopter flew over the rugged terrain below, Elena's thoughts drifted back to the people she had once saved. The faces of the patients, the ones who had survived because of her skills, haunted her. They were her only connection to the life she had left behind. The life she had once believed in, but now even their faces were fading, lost to the shadows of her past. The helicopter touched down on a remote airstrip, and Elena was whisked away by FSB agents to the safe house where she would carry out the mission. The target, an influential figure with ties to the Russian military, was already in custody. But his life would be ended soon, and Elena would be the one to end it. The agents briefed her quickly, giving her all the necessary information, but Elena barely listened. She had no need to know the details. All that mattered was that she was there to do a job, and she would do it without question. Inside the safe house, the target was waiting, sitting in a chair, his face grim and resigned. Elena didn't look at him. She didn't care who he was or what he had done. She wasn't there to judge him. She was there to complete the mission. She approached him silently, her gloves already on, her hands steady. As she worked, she could hear his breathing, shallow and labored. He was scared, but he didn't beg. He knew there was no escaping what was coming. Elena didn't feel pity. She didn't feel anything. She had been trained to shut off her emotions, to focus only on the task at hand. And that's what she did. The mission was simple, and it was over quickly. The target was dead, and Elena was already moving on to the next one. She had completed another mission, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. She wasn't just a surgeon anymore. She wasn't just a soldier. She was a weapon, and the FSB had turned her into one. The world outside the safe house was silent, but Elena's mind was far from it. She had lost so much, and now there was nothing left to lose. The only thing that mattered now was survival. The FSB would use her again, and she would do what they asked. There was no other choice. As she left the safe house and climbed into the waiting vehicle, Elena could feel the weight of her decision pressing down on her. She had chosen this life, and now she would live it to the end. There would be no redemption, no escape. She had crossed the line, and she would never be the same again. The FSB was her only ally now, and she would serve them as long as they needed her. She had become what they had made her: a ghost, a weapon, a tool of the state. And there was no way out. As the car drove into the distance, Elena knew that the life she had once known was gone. She was no longer the person she had been. She had become someone else entirely. And as the sun set behind her, Elena realized that she would never look back. The path she had chosen was the only one left for her to walk, and there would be no turning back.